This is a production of Cornell University.
First of all, thanks to Dr. Ray Cao and his wife for hosting us while we're here in Ithaca. Thanks to Cornell for having me back. I think I was here about 1.5 years ago, and it's great to be back. So a little about myself. I'm going to speak a little quickly just because I know I have about 40 minutes, and when I get to about 30 minutes, I'll go even faster than I thought. So do let me know when I get close to that point. But I'm a pediatrician. Normally I practice 5 days a week. I'm actually traveling the world for 1 year on a research year with my wife, Bella, and my child, Kai, who are sitting in the front row over here as well. So I've made the title of this talk a bit broader than I usually do, sort of, the ties, the ties between nature and human health and sort of reconnecting us back with nature. We've lived in natural settings for thousands of years and evolved in natural settings. It's only really been in very recent history that we are now spending about 90% of our time indoors. That's the average American anyway. My disclosures, I think Dawn already made for me. Dr. Ray Cao did. I'm the medical director for ParkerX America, and there's no other commercial affiliations as of yet. Learning objectives are pretty straightforward. I want to talk about epidemics. I also want to talk about the epidemic in the context of climate change, natural resources, and this continuing trend towards urbanization. Then I want to dive in as fast as I can to the scientific literature. There's a lot out there. There's more than 500 published studies, scientific studies that have looked at the connection between nature and human health. And then very quickly, just give you a little glimpse as to what kinds of things are happening in the world of application. So how can we take this science and actually put it into some sort of applied daily routines? You hear about climate change all the time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just a couple of graphics to remind us about the sort of, doom that we hear about on a daily basis, not just here in the US, but around the world. Natural resources are a very important topic. I've been working in this field, this area for about 10 years now, and I've even heard people say, let's not use the word natural, the phrase natural resources, because nature is more than just a resource. But having said that, just to remind us that those of us who live in high-income countries are using many more times the resources than those who are living in low-income countries. Perhaps the most important context that I can part with you today is this issue of accelerating urbanization. So this is a picture that you see all over the world. We just got back from traveling in Lima, in Bogota, and if anybody's been to these capital cities of Latin America, you know what I'm talking about. Just incredible density, oftentimes very little nature, huge, vast slums. And this is often how many of the world's population is living. And to compound that, we're moving, as a species, we're moving into urban areas at a really high rate. So by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population will be living in cities. Now, to me, this means that we need to rethink how we live in cities. What is in our cities? How does that affect our health? And what I wanted to point out was even the United Nations, one of the sustainable goals, number 11 to be specific, mentions the importance of creating green public space. Green public space. And I don't see that very often, like in literature. I don't see it certainly in the medical literature very often. I don't even see it that often in the public health world, which I also come from. But it's increasingly important, as you can tell, as we have this accelerating urbanization, to think about cities. That's where we're going to be living. That's where we're moving to. And how can we incorporate a little more greenness, perhaps, into our lives? So this is not the world. This is actually looking at the US. This is a look at chronic disease in the US, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, just to give you some scope of what we're talking about here. There's a lot going on. This is what I see on a daily basis. Although I'm a pediatrician, and even though I thought that I was going into a career where I would deal with a lot of runny noses and strep throats and things like that, what I'm dealing mostly with is that stuff, but in the context of prediabetes, diabetes, high blood pressure, certainly lots and lots of obesity, and a ton of mental health problems. So that's really my life. I give vaccines and all that stuff that we do as primary care pediatricians, but I do it in the context of a lot of chronic disease. So kids we were taught to say that kids aren't little adults, but to be honest with you, kids are looking more and more like their adult peers. And these are problems that you usually think of in the adult world. There's also an epidemic of nature deficit. Now, this is very hard to read for a reason, because this is the amount of time, 7 minutes, 4 to 7 minutes, is the average amount of time a child spends in unstructured play outside every day. This is the amount of time, 7 hours, that they spend, average amount of time on some kind of an electronic device or some kind of screen time. Now, granted, it may be doing homework. It's not always, playing video games. But this is a good way to sort of see what's happening in terms of the way we spend our days. And I didn't point out, I don't think I did, this is in 4 to 7-year-olds. So you can only imagine what happens as they grow up. It actually usually intensifies, and it establishes a routine and a pattern that they actually that they use for the rest of their life. The same is true with other behaviors. We know that smoking, if you start smoking before the age of 18, you're much, much more likely to smoke for the rest of your life than starting initiation of smoking after the age of 18. These are the top 10 causes of death, also that are, I put up here in part because every one of these is either directly or indirectly related to this, our lifestyle, right? This is a bit exaggerated here, but we sit a lot. We don't always eat the right kinds of food in the right kinds of ways, in the right amount of time. We have a lot of stress. And then when you have all these 3 things, you develop one of these 3 things, and then you come to me and you ask for these. It's generally my life, what I see on my end of things. And which is really true for most of us who are in the practicing world. All right, enough doom and gloom. So this is the nature pyramid. There used to be a food pyramid, which you may or may not remember, which I don't like very much. Now we use the plate and we portion it out. I actually really do like the nature pyramid because it gives you a good idea, and this is from, I believe, the University of North Carolina. I think. But anyway, what I want to point out is on the very bottom of the pyramid is low frequency, high frequency, low intensity. So these are the things like the gardens, the rooftops, campus here. You have a lot of greenery here, things that you might actually see every day, maybe even every hour. And as you move toward the top of the pyramid, it's much more intense and less frequent. So I just went to, hike on the Inca Trail. I may never do that again in my life, right? So very, very low frequency, high intensity, right? So it was amazing. I saw the Urubamba River. I saw orchids just peering over thousands of feet drop. Amazing things I saw, which is great, wonderful. But it's not what we're going to do every day. So I'm focusing my career and my time down here. I happen to call it the foundational work because it is the foundation of the pyramid. But it is really important, especially as we move into cities. And more so, we live in cities, we move into cities, because this is what most people are going to have access to, not traveling to even a state park, which many of my patients, I work at a community health center, so I see primarily low-income patients in DC, Columbia Heights. So even they rarely get to Rock Creek, which is just a mile away, right? And they even more rarely get to Blue Ridge Mountains, for example, which is an hour-and-a-half drive away. So having city parks, having urban areas, having gardens, having greenery around you is even more important for these populations. On to the evidence. So not everybody here may know what a systematic review is. I think the majority of you probably do, but it's important to have inclusion criteria. Often a meta-analysis is part of a systematic review, and it's a quick way for us to take a bunch of data and different numbers of studies that might actually give you some insight into certain questions that need to be asked. So the questions are, what happens when we spend time outdoors? I'm going to go through a series of studies, and you'll see some of the similarities as I go through this. One certainly is there's a marker for stress, a biomarker, cortisol, stress cortisol. There's a decrease in that, decrease in heart rate. These are all decrease in blood pressure, cholesterol. I don't want to read all of these. You can read them yourself. Heart rate variability is important, and that is our ability to go up and then back down again, and how quickly you get back down again. So you want actually a high heart rate variability, not a low heart rate variability. When I was a med student and doing OB, we talked about that with the fetal rate. But actually, it's now used oftentimes to talk about the effective nature on human health. Another systematic review focused on 133 controlled studies. And the intervention itself was these adventure-based activities, short-term walking, seated relaxation in natural environments. And what did they find? They found, this is more the mental health piece, but psychological well-being, psychosocial function, psychophysiological stress response, cognitive performance, all these things improved. One of the things that's a little difficult in this literature is that even though I mentioned there are over 500 studies that are published, they're all seemingly quite different in their methodology and study design. So it makes doing a systematic review kind of hard. It makes coming with these grand conclusions a little bit hard. So I just want to point that out, that this is, we're still learning a lot about nature and human health. We're learning about the mechanisms as well. There's another study here done in 2018. I tried to find the most sort of recent group of studies that has come out. And you see a decrease in mortality, heart rate, and violence. Some of the earliest studies done by Min Kuo and University of Illinois were actually looking at a low-income housing that was built, initially had greenery quite a bit. Over the years, wasn't maintained in some areas, was maintained in others. And what she found was, not to her surprise really, because she worked with animals before, caged animals and animals living in natural environments, was that the animals who lived in more natural environments, they lived longer, they had better social interactions. And the same she found was true for humans. So where humans lived in this low-income housing that had some greenery, they had less violence, they had better social interactions. So it's not surprising that you would live longer if you lived closer to and therefore had more access to green space. Another thing that's been found, which maybe is intuitive to many people, is an increase in physical activity. And it wasn't necessarily intuitive to me initially, but when I think about it, when I'm outside and when you're outside, you are much more likely to move. Even if you picnic outside, you're more likely to get up and walk around, throw the frisbee, maybe investigate something. You're more likely to eat slowly, actually, when you're outside. So there's interesting things that we've been able to find. Attention and mood, I'll get to in just a second. There has been some research looking at ADHD, and I'll mention that in Dr. Kuo's work just a little bit later on. Forest therapy. I wanted to share with you a little bit. I don't know if you mentioned already, but I'll be doing a walk, and it's really for Dr. Ray Cao's class. And it's going to be a 2.5-hour forest therapy walk. So the question is, being out in this forested area or being out in nature, what are the effects? What actually happens? So one study did look at that, a relatively small sample size. But they did find some positive impacts, so lowering in high blood pressure, some cardiac and pulmonary function improvement, and you can see the rest of those things listed here. There is strong evidence that greenness is associated with even more things, so improvements in birth weight, I mentioned physical activity. And this has led even some researchers to talk about policy. So we probably should be thinking about, once again, how to design, how to change cities, how to design cities, urban areas, so that all people have access to these areas. I'm going to run over here. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go a little faster. Okay, I just want to make sure there's a lot of science in here, but I think for the purpose of this lecture, we'll go a little bit faster. There's some individual studies that I found fascinating I wanted to share with you. This is a pretty recent study done in 2018, and it was done in Spain. There were 2 different areas where they tracked children through many years. And what they did was they had 2 areas. One area had and they looked sort of geospatially to see how green and not green these 2 areas were. So one area not very green, one area quite green. And to my surprise, they actually did functional MRIs, and they measured the difference in brain mass. And what they found was the kids who grew up in areas where it was much greener actually had larger brains. That correlated with better working memory and reduced inattentiveness. There are studies looking at children and their school settings. So whether a forest school versus a non-forest school, and what are the differences? In cortisol, I mentioned cortisol is a stress hormone. So we know that forest school students have a steady decline in cortisol. And we know it's constant throughout the year. And we also know that the profile of these students in the indoor class are similar to individuals prone to stress-associated mental disorders like depression. So there is already some evidence looking and evaluating the outcomes in these kinds of educational settings. This is a study that I actually did. There aren't many studies yet looking at the PARK prescription, meaning a educator, a health professional would actually write a prescription. And by the way, that's happening, has been happening for, is it 2 years now or more at Cornell, 2 years at Cornell Health. Dr. Ray Cao will talk about that in just a little bit. So it's the idea of actually writing a prescription for a patient or a client to spend time in nature. And I'll talk more about the way that I do it and that my nonprofit actually promotes that. This was done in 2013, and what we found was something very important to me, which was this was a sort of before and after. So pre and post intervention. Intervention was the PARK prescription. It was in children. And what we found was that children are definitely more likely to visit a park and actually increase their level of physical activity by virtue of the prescription. This is another study done by another pediatrician, a colleague of mine at UCSF, Dr. Razani. And what she did was a randomized trial, and she had 2 groups of kids and families. One received the very plain PARK prescription, which I do. And then one group received the PARK prescription plus all the bells and whistles, which means they got transportation provided for them on Saturdays. They went to a local park. They had a naturalist with them. They had a photographer with them. They had food with them. It was a production, okay? And they do this every Saturday, and it's called SHINE. It's an acronym for the organization that she's founded. And what she looked at was stress reduction. And to her surprise, the group that got just the plain PARK prescription with no bells and whistles did just as well in stress reduction. So, you know, good for all of us, really, not just good for me, right? Because I was reassured that you don't have to have all those resources necessarily to make some value out of this PARK prescription, that there's something happening there. My own hypothesis is that there's something special in that relationship between a client, patient, and their primary care provider, their psychologist, their educator, some trusted professional in their life. And I think that has a lot to do with this, is why it's actually happening. I mentioned Dr. Kuo-Ming Kuo. Dr. Taylor, Dr. Kuo did a study that's one of these landmark studies about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Once again, actually, there were more than 2. There were 3 treatment arms. One arm of kids, so these are kids who all have ADHD. One went to a city park, and the other 2 went to urban settings. And what she found was that the kids who went to a park and had unstructured play did just as well in their ADHD symptomology. So there's a checklist of symptoms for ADHD, as kids who've had a dose of methylphenidate, which is a stimulant, at 4 hours out, which is the maximal effect usually on a short-acting stimulant medication, as the kids who went on a walk played in a natural setting. This is not to say that, if anybody in here has ADHD, you should stop your meds right away and go out to the Botanic Gardens. But it is a little bit of food for thought to think about here, could nature actually be a treatment option for many kids? And I think the answer is, for my own practice, that it's certainly an adjunct. So when I have kids who come in with attention problems, one of the first things I do is we talk about diet, their routine, and certainly play. Where do they play? Do they play outside? Things like that. And what I find even in the very, very low income populations is that they just don't have that kind of unstructured time, very similar to kids of high income. I mentioned forest bathing. So Shinrin-yoku is the Japanese term for forest bathing. And there is another realm of research done in Japan. How am I doing on time? Good. And so Dr. Lee did this research. This was pretty landmark research looking at not just at natural killer cells, but that's what's talked about a lot. And natural killer cells are an important part of our immune system. They're a more ancient part of our immune system and thought to really protect us against cancer. So they float around our blood and they look for abnormalities, they look for cells that are reproducing too fast, hence cells that might be heading towards the cancer, and they take care of that problem. So having natural killer cells is a good thing. Having activity, natural killer cell activity is a good thing, better thing for you. So one thing that has been established is that the phytoncides, these essential oils, and I'm not a botanist, I'm not a horticulturalist, but from what I understand, yell out if I'm saying something completely off the mark here, but I think it's cypress and pine are 2 of the
oaks, cypress, and a number of other genera.
Okay, so pines, oaks, and cypresses, cypress, to give you an example, have these natural occurring chemicals that do seem to increase our level of natural killer cells. And among other things I mentioned in here as well, I don't want to go to other chemical mediators, but I put them in there if you wanted to see. I thought what was most fascinating with this is that if you look over here, so these are 2-night, 3-day excursions going into a forested area in Japan. And what happens, when you take blood samples and you measure natural killer cells on before day 1, 2, 7, and 30. And what they found was that it rises, it elevates, but it stays elevated. It stays elevated 30 days out. And when you compare that to an urban setting, you don't see any significant change. So one of the points that they suggested in this research is, frequency, right? So how often should we go into a forested area? How often should we do these kinds of outings? He's suggesting, and the team is suggesting, that maybe at least once a month, which I think is pretty phenomenal, that there's even a frequency and perhaps a dose related to this. So I've gone through quite a bit of the research. I hope I've left you with something perhaps you haven't seen before. There are many places, obviously this crowd knows where to go to find scientific studies, but you may not have heard of the Children in Nature Network Research Library. And if you haven't heard of it, it's a good place. And it's not just about children, it actually spans all ages. And it's a nice compilation of the research that's been done on nature and health in one place. So I go to PubMed too, but it's a nice, really easy place to find a lot of what I've just gone through with you. So what does this mean for me? What does this mean for all my colleagues around the world, frankly? And when I heard Rich Louv speak, when I read his book, Last Child in the Woods, and since then many other books, Nature Fix is another one I've read by Florence Williams. I'm a doctor, I'm a plumber, I'm a technician, I'm not, I haven't been a researcher so intensely involved as many of you have been or will be. But I'm practical. I want to know what I can do with this. I want to know, where do we apply this, as do you. So, but when I go back to the office, I want to know, how can I put this information into practice? So I want to give you some idea of what I have done and what others have done. So there's 4 programs that come to mind: Track Trails, Walk with the Doc, Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, and ParkerX America. I mentioned forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku, which is an ancient Japanese tradition. Nothing really new about that. But the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy has taken the concept of forest bathing and really gone in a slightly different direction. So it's called nature therapy. And the idea is for a guide to really open the doors, so to speak, to a therapy that is experienced by virtue of being in nature, to put it simply. I'm talking a little bit from a scientific perspective, but I'm also talking from a personal one, because I'm right now a guide. I'm a guide in training for the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy. So I went through an 8-day course, and I'm in my 6-month practicum right now, and I'm actually leading a walk, a 2.5-hour walk today. There's a standard set of principles and values for all of us who are guides. There are over 600 guides. This might be a little outdated. It's on their website, and I was trying to get you a more recent number. I've in communication with the 2 directors. I think it's closer to 1,000 guides right now around the world. A majority of them are going to be in the U.S., Europe, Australia, those countries, but they are in sprinkling around the world. And the idea really is that when you are taking this science, because there's a lot of science now, what do you do with it? And the role of the guide is to, create a safe place, to use a standard sequence. So it's not random what we do in that sense. And we start off with something that we do these things called invitations. So we invite you to open your senses, and wherever that nature, that place might be, and really engage your senses. And by virtue of doing that, clearly there are physical outcomes that come from that. There are mental health outcomes that come from that. But in addition to that, in my own personal experience, there's also this relational thing that happens. So you start to form a relationship with nature, which I think is also probably part of what's happening in terms of our getting better. There's a concept in ANFT, in the Association of Nature and Forest Therapy, called medicine. And it's not the medicine that I was taught necessarily, but medicine for us, we define medicine as not my curing you, but rather a reciprocal relationship. So if I'm relating to a tree, or I'm relating to fauna, they're also relating back to me. So a phrase that's often used is the more than human world. What's out there, and how do we relate to it? A little woo-woo for some people when you first hear about it. It's okay. That was one of my edges when I first started. I was like, I don't know, I'm a doctor. I don't know if I could do this. You know, I write prescriptions. But I've really taken to it, and I think there's a lot of value in this. And just even being in the Botanic Gardens today, walking along the gorges, going to a state park yesterday, just being here on this campus, there's a lot that could happen, I think, here on the campus that might be done through this means. Pretty amazing stuff that happens through this association. David, I know all the founders, yeah, of all these organizations. So going back, Amos Clifford is the person who started this. David Sabier is a cardiologist based in Ohio. He started an organization that's now international called Walk with a Doc. This is probably a little more out in the popular culture. Anybody heard of Walk with a Doc? Not yet. Okay. Very simple idea, right? So you walk with a doc. It doesn't get too much simpler than that. So David got frustrated many years ago about, his patient is not doing so well. There's a branch of cardiology called preventive cardiology. He doesn't just do that, but if I have a patient who's morbidly obese and whatever I'm doing is not working, I sometimes will refer to a preventive cardiologist to see what can be done on their end as well. So he suggested on some Saturday, listen, and to all his, I don't know how he did this, but he must have sent out a communication to all his patients. I'm going to be at this park on Saturday. If you want to join me, I'm going for a walk. 100 of his patients showed up. There is a thirst, there's an appetite for this, much more than we think. And to walk with your doctor is pretty cool, because usually you have to go to their office, you have to pay them, you have to have insurance and whatnot. So a really neat idea. It's taken root. And often I've been on these walks before myself. They're great walks. And usually there's a brief presentation before the walk, and it's usually done, outdoors, but it can be done indoors. And questions and the conversation happens as you walk. And the one I went on was probably about an hour and a half or so. We did it at the US Arboretum. There's over 500 chapters worldwide, and you can see here how fast it's growing from 14 to 18, the number of walks, and then the walker visits per year. So it is working. I don't have all of their data, but I encourage you to visit their website and learn more about them. There is Cornell Health here. There's a city here. So there are doctors here. It doesn't have to be a doctor now. It's really been, there are nurse practitioners or other types of specialists who are, and health practitioners who are doing this as well. Jason Uros runs track trails, kids in parks, and also a very, very wonderful program. The idea here is that this was really started primarily focused on children, although now I understand it's also including adults. But the idea is that if we can get people out to trails, and they initially partnered with pediatricians' offices. It started in North Carolina. They had some funding from the Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation, National Park Service, and Blue Cross Blue Shield. And the idea was to connect people with these trails by virtue of the pediatricians' offices. So they would put up the information about what can happen, how you can get connected to these trails. On the trails, they're keeping you engaged. So they have activities you can do actually on the trails, from biking, hiking, geocaching, paddling. I remember way back they were doing the disc golf as well. So it's keeping folks engaged. There's also sort of this treasure hunt sort of a thing. So when you go, and I've gone on these myself as well, we have several in the DC area. And what they do is they partner with parks, park agencies, national parks, state parks, municipal parks, who already have the trails. So they're not building trails. They're partnering with those agencies, and they'll put up some of the signage and allow the activities to happen on those trails. And they're tracking the steps and the numbers of times these kids are actually doing this. So they have fantastic data that this actually works. The last one is my organization, ParkerX America. We started out in DC. We called ourselves DC ParkerX. We had initially 20 parks around the health center where I work. that were in a platform for us to prescribe. We now have over 7,000 parks in our platform. We are not a program. ParkerX America is really a platform, meaning that you could take this idea of prescribing to any place in the world where you would find some accessible green space, some burden of chronic disease, and a willingness to prescribe. Those are really the three important ingredients. We are a nonprofit. The main goal, our main mission really, is to educate health professionals, provide them with a tool, a platform for them to actually prescribe to their patients. It's free, so we don't charge anything for it. And the prescription itself is something that I've struggled with for years. You think, why would I struggle with a prescription? I'm a doctor. But what I mean by that is the PARK prescription. Now, clearly, if I were to prescribe an antibiotic or some medication to you, I wouldn't say to you, Dr. Ray Cao, take any antibiotic you like for as often as you like, whatever dose you like, with or without food, and I'll see you back whenever. Right? It's a 10-day course. It's twice a day. It's 500 milligrams, or it's a liquid for child. It's palatable. You with food, avoid the sun. You give somebody some specific instructions that makes up the prescription. So I really ran with this, and I said, you know what? Let's just do this for the PARK prescription, because I was finding that a lot of these incredible programs, these PARK prescription programs around the country, were kind of loosey-goosey about the prescription, and I wanted to say, I don't think that's going to work. And so what I wanted to do a trial on was, let's make it specific. So the PARK prescription that we do on our platform is very specific. It has to have a park or a place, right? It has to have an activity. Now, the activity could be, you can imagine, a lot of different things, right? It could be stargazing. It could be forest bathing. It could be playing tennis. It could be taking your dog for a walk, things that your patients tell you about what they want to do, what they like to do. The place is important because I want them to tell me where they feel comfortable, where they feel safe, where is close to them. So those are the first two. The second two things are the frequency and the duration. I need to know how long they're willing to commit to this activity when they do it, and how many times per week. Bingo. Now I've got it. My time is almost up, or it's up. So this is how I define the PARK prescription. It's not how the world defines it. I would like the world to define it this way, but we're not there yet. So I'm really pushing for this because I think it's important to standardize and harmonize so we can research and evaluate and study and make it clinically effective for all of us to do it the same way within those parameters. It's electronic, so I send my patient a text or an email. They get it, and they respond every time they go. So when I see them at the follow-up visit, I know how many times they filled their prescription. I don't know that about antibiotics. I do know that about the PARK prescription. So when I walk in, I have knowledge, and I'm holding them to that contract as well. We have over 500 prescribers around the world, mostly in the US right now. We've made a lot of prescriptions, and we've had a lot filled. Don't be discouraged. What's happening, I have found, is a lot of these 500 plus are doing it their way. And I'm encouraging them to do it our way. So it's more clinically relevant to them, to their patients, more effective, and so I can have the data. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Ray Cao. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zarr, for sharing so much meaningful and really inspiring information with us. What I'd like to do is build from the remarks that Dr. Zarr shared with us and talk about a specific program that we have here at Cornell called Nature RX at Cornell. So many of you are graduate students, some of you are undergraduate students, and the first thing I'd like to share is that college should be a time of learning, for exploration, for developing new skills, and for fun. College should be fun. But for so many students, college and university life is filled with mental and physical and performance-related problems. The latest 2018 National Collegiate Health Assessment just came out. They surveyed nearly 28,000 students on 44 campuses. And here are some of the findings from that large assessment. in the previous 12 months, 20% of students felt that things were hopeless. 20% of students felt very lonely. 17% of students felt so depressed that it was difficult to function. And 18% felt overwhelming anxiety or overwhelming anger. And nearly 7% indicated that they had considered suicide. These are staggering and very disturbing statistics. So based on all that Dr. Zarr just shared with us, we know that there is a body of scientific evidence that clearly indicates that spending time in nature is beneficial to us physically, physiologically, behaviorally. So our challenge is, how do we convince students here at Cornell and at other campuses to actually spend intentional time out in nature? And the reason I include that word intentional is that I've done some very unscientific preliminary investigating by standing on one end of the Trip Hammer Bridge and watched students crossing over that bridge in the morning on their way to class. And 90% of them are looking at their iPhones. They're not aware of the fact that this spectacularly beautiful Beebe Lake and Trip Hammer Falls are right there. So to me, those are unintentional experiences in nature. So a number of years ago, several colleagues and I, David Cutter being one of them, were on a coffee break during some Cornell conference. And we started to think about the fact that Cornell has truly one of the most beautiful campuses in America, but that we also have one of the highest percentages in our student body of students suffering from mental health problems. So we thought, couldn't there be some way of better utilizing all of that natural beauty and horticultural beauty as a way of contributing to the well-being of our students? And that really was the genesis of NatureRx at Cornell. So there are 5 components of NatureRx, and I'd like to speak about each of these individually. A nature prescription program, a NatureRx website, a NatureRx class that Dr. Zarr and I are about to go off to, a nature e-postering, and finally, a student NatureRx club. And I'm glad to see we have some of the officers of the club here. So first, the nature prescriptions. As Dr. Zarr mentioned, this program started at Cornell Health a couple of years ago. And at that time, we were working with a relatively small number of health professionals at Cornell Health, but we had convinced these health professionals to hand out a paper prescription as part of the therapy or treatment recommended for students who were suffering from depression, anxiety, high levels of stress, obesity, self-cutting, suicidal ideation, any of those complexes. And it said, take a walk or run around Beebe Lake, rest on the slope, enjoy a sunset, and spend 20 minutes 2 to 3 times a week. Well, some students actually paid attention to this. We think that many students did not. So in this previous academic year, we actually were able to integrate the nature prescription into the electronic health record. And it's very hard for you to see from there, but you can see it says NatureRx discussed and recommended. So now, in this previous academic year, over 700 students were recommended time in nature by more than 24 health professionals at Cornell Health. Before I move on to that, a new development that is about to start, which we are particularly excited about, is that this year, Cornell Health has developed a method to confidentially and anonymously survey all of the students getting prescribed nature so that we'll be able to assess things like, did they in fact follow the prescription? How frequently are they going out in nature? Where are they going out in nature? Is it reducing their stress level? So we'll have an actual body of information about Cornell students being prescribed nature. Another component of the program is our NatureRx website, naturerx.cornell.edu. Don't look it up right now, listen to me, but do look it up right after the seminar. So the idea behind the website is we wanted students, we do want students, to get over the mindset of, oh yeah, you know, I've heard nature is good for me, but I don't have an hour to devote for that. I have to get to class, I have to go to lab, I have to write papers. So through this website, we profile 15 natural and landscape sites around campus, many of them managed by Cornell Botanic Gardens, and we provide GPS-based walking directions on how to get from wherever you are right now to the nearest NatureRx site. Typically 5 minutes or less of walking time to get to that site. So you don't have an hour? That's fine. Take 15 minutes to walk to this site, spend a little time there, and then walk to your next assignment. A third element is our NatureRx class. We piloted this class last fall, and based on the success of it, we have now made it a regular part of the curriculum, PLSCI 1125. It's also part of engaged learning where you live at Cornell, so it's intended to appeal particularly to first-year students at North Campus and second-year students, and we're very grateful that Engaged Cornell is providing funding for the class. So we have 18 students enrolled in the course this fall, and as Dr. Zarr just explained, we're about to, or he is about to take them on a 2-hour nature therapy experience and walk. So in the class last year, as part of the curriculum, I asked the students to develop a relationship with a spot on campus in which they would feel particularly safe and calm. And I had them write critical reflections about their special spot. But one week I said, your assignment for next week is to develop a non-written reflection on your spot of peace and calm. So some students did art pieces that were reflections of their special spot. One student who is a freshman, so was here for the very first time, had come from South Florida and had never experienced autumn before. So she played the fall component of Vivaldi's Four Seasons as her way of showing her appreciation for experiencing fall. A fourth component of NatureRx at Cornell, we don't want just the students who are experiencing mental health problems and going to Cornell Health to know about and take advantage of NatureRx, and just the students who are enrolled in our NatureRx class. We want all students to be aware of this. So working with the communications team at Cornell Health, we have developed this series of e-posters. You may have seen them in the foyer of the Plant Science Building. And they say such things as, did you know that time spent in nature can improve your exam scores, improve your social life, improve your sleep patterns, and reduce overall stress levels. And for each of these, we cite papers that have verified that benefit. Finally, we have a Nature RX club made up of both undergraduate students and grad students, and the club is just forming for this academic year, and they are planning a series of walks in nature, experiences in nature, presentations by people related to this field, and hopefully that Nature RX Club is going to expand and engage more and more students. Also, I recently wrote and or co-authored and published a book with Dr. Gregory Eels, who until recently was the director of our counseling and psychiatric services division of Cornell Health, and it is called Nature RX, Improving College Student Mental Health. And in that book, we provide an overview of the kinds of mental health challenges students are facing today. We also provide a stepwise process for developing a Nature RX program on your campus. And we talk about the role of Nature RX programs in the context of the future of the American university. The final thing I'll mention is that the Nature RX program here at Cornell is just one of several Nature RX programs on American campuses. In our book, we profile the programs at Cornell, but also at 3 other campuses: UC Davis, University of Minnesota, and College of William and Mary. From that core of 4 colleges and universities, we have just this year developed a Nature RX campus network, and the network members are all over the US and just starting to be in Canada also. And it's large universities, small universities, colleges, geographically diverse. And as the coordinator of the campus Nature RX network, I send a weekly e-newsletter to the members in which the best practices at individual campuses are described, opportunities for collaboration are brought out, recent literature that is pertinent to our field is cited, and a subgroup of network members are now working on developing a virtual symposium for campuses for next spring, in which we're hoping to involve 100 or more campuses around North America. So there's no doubt that we live in a very tense and stress-filled world. We live in a world with unfortunate but tremendous examples of environmental degradation. But we also live in a world where there are programs like ParkerX America, like our campus Nature RX movement, that really gives us hope for the future because they recognize the human benefits of time in nature and they provide mechanisms for people to spend that time. So thank you very much on behalf of Dr. Zarr and myself. And I would like to say that we have time for questions. I think we can take maybe 2, and then we actually have to go off to the Nature RX class. So if there are a couple of questions, David.
Thank you both for fabulous talks and programs. And I particularly like the father-son matching shirt. One of the easiest ways of getting access to green spaces in urban environments is to create smallish horticultural gardens. Has anybody looked at the difference between visiting a small horticultural garden versus getting out in a bigger nature place with big trees, etc.?
I can address that. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at the human health benefits of spending time in a botanical garden. Those studies have not quantified size of garden and related that to impact. But one study that looked at 4 different botanic gardens in Florida found that the experience of walking through the garden was particularly impactful for that cohort that had self-identified before the visit as having very high stress levels. So we know that spending time in a botanic garden can reduce stress and cortisol levels and blood pressure. So it does not, I'm fond of saying it doesn't have to involve the forest primeval. One more question. Anyone? Yes, Ken.
Dr. Zarr, most of the studies you cited were fairly structured along the prescription. But what about a more natural experiment? For example, Ithaca has, as you know, has many opportunities, state parks and gorges, and if you take a large random sample, there are already people not doing it in a structured way, but hiking. Would those people be healthier than the group that's more sedentary?
Yeah, so just a quick thank you for the question. And the question is, in terms of the studies that I was going through, and just to be, just a quick, clarification. The vast majority of the research is actually not on the park prescription. The vast majority of the research, it has to do with the things that you just mentioned, is just people being in green space, living near green space, having access to green space, group outings, things of that nature. The literature is pretty convincing that being in or near these green areas has a substantial health effect. And I went through a lot of those with all of you. In fact, the opposite is true with the studies, that we have a paucity of studies that are more clinically focused. And on that note, I'll be partnering, I am partnering actually now already with RAND Corporation, Deb Cohen, and we're going to be doing a randomized trial funded by the NIH. It's a 5-year trial, and we're going to look at the more clinical side of things. We're going to be looking at the accelerometry. So, whether it's moderate to vigorous physical activity as a result of the prescription, we're going to be looking at some diabetes measures, cholesterol, triglycerides, and ADHD. So we're going to be looking at those. But there, as I mentioned earlier, there's really just a handful of studies that are clinical studies. But, despite having so few clinical studies, I'm very convinced with the science that being in nature has measurable and many positive effects on human health.
So I would love to have us stay and answer further questions, but class time beckons for us and probably for many of you. So thank you for your attention this afternoon, and we will see you again next Monday.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.